Okay, now we're going to speak about part 2 of Michael Marsh's infamous letter to Our Firm Foundation. Now, part 1 we looked at, he's addressing their misteachings on righteousness by faith or justification by faith. In other words, how Christ does for us in our place as our substitute. He works out a righteousness in his life of what's called active obedience. In other words, this is where he lives out a perfect life. He redoes the entire history of the human being. Even the history of Israel. Israel was to be a prophetic picture of the overcomer in Jacob. The idea of prevailing with God by laying a hold of his robe and being broken and coming under faith and trust in God. A picture of an overcomer, ironically. So what we have here is Christ coming and living out the perfection of humanity for humanity as humanity's substitute in what's called the promissory covenant. Now the promissory covenant, as we have talked about, is this idea that it's a righteousness which you could obtain to by faith. God said that he would work out a righteousness in himself, in his body and in his experience, that he would come and be Emmanuel. He will incarnate himself. He will make himself, and he will have a body prepared for him. He will completely and totally become humanity. Now, in becoming and totally possessing humanity, does he possess the taint of sin? Does he become one in which he possesses indwelling sin? Is Christ one that has a sinful propensity, and does he fight inbred sin? And does this inbred sin disqualify him from being our atonement, our perfect victim sacrifice? Would that inbred sin be condemnatory? Would he become, quote, culpable of possessing sin and therefore could not be offered as a substitute for us? So that's the question. What is the nature of Christ? When the book of Hebrews talks about a body has he prepared, that God had prepared a body for Christ to come and to be man's substitute, what would that body possess? When it talks about that the veil is his flesh, fundamentally in the book of Hebrews, how is it so that we enter into the temple, or that we could see the manifest glory of God in the very nature of Christ? So if you look at the veil, or if you look at the temple veil, you could see the very interweavingness of Christ. Was there a thread of the taint of sin? And if that thread is there, would it destroy him from being our atonement? And that is the key to understand, because throughout Scripture it says that man is by nature a transgressor, is by nature one that in his best state is still vanity. That even Ephesians chapter 2 is looking at humanity as under the bondage of sin. So it's very important to understand that if we're looking at the nature of Christ, is that nature one that possessed that indwelling sin in which Paul cries out, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" Did Christ possess that body? We're not talking about one who is sinning. Romans chapter 7 is looking at Paul the apostle in the present tense, the present continual tense of the word. It's looking at a Paul the apostle that is looking at him as an overcomer and is looking at the limitations and the taintedness of his obedience, that he is crying out for a mediator or an intercessor or one that stands in his place, imputing the rest of what is falling short in his obedience. He is lamenting the shortfall of his obedience. Now remember in verse 14 of Romans chapter 7, in which there is, "I'm doing the things that I will not to do," the tenses of the word there is talking about I'm willing not to do what my sinful nature is telling me to do. I see that in my flesh that there is a law, And this law is what? Sold under, and this is the definite article of the sin. And it's pointing back to the sin of Adam. The sin, the ultimate sin, the sin that threw all of humanity into the crises of condemnation and under the pall of sin and death. So even Paul himself says, hey, from Adam to Sinai, there was still death. There was still the obvious reality that we were under the condemnation of the law. And when God brought forth the law, that it pointed out in the sinner his condemnation, that it strengthens sin. But for Christ, he came in a very unique position. He came as our sin substitute. And so the key is how did Christ, quote, condemn sin in the flesh? What is this condemning sin in the flesh? Now, was this talking about Christ had sin in his flesh? And within his flesh that he was condemning the sin that was inside of himself? That inside of Jesus Christ he had sin and he was condemning that sin that was in himself? People teach that. Well, our firm foundation was teaching that. So Michael Marsh is trying to display the fallacy that they're trying to actually display and show and teach a Christ that would have disqualified him from being a sinless substitute. It would have disqualified him from being the atonement that was required, because the atonement, the animal that was pictured in typology, was perfectly sinless, not in just its being. They would cut open the animal and look inside, and they would take out all the various innards of that animal, and there could not be any flaw. And that picture is a picture of the internal qualities that are there. We're not talking about sinning, but we're talking about sinful. What is the difference? Sinning is something that you do, even in your mind or in your heart. But being sinful is more of a picture of your state, your being, who you are. So can the very nature of Christ be fully sinful in that he is tainted with sin, and would that disqualify him from being the perfect substitute and atonement? Now it's interesting when you really look at Scripture deeply upon it, when it says that he was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. Even the language that's in the original language is talking about tempted in all points like as we are, yet without this picture of his innate sinfulness. Innate sinfulness would have disqualified Christ from being our substitute. Remember, he had to be one that had the government rest upon his shoulders. That was what was prophesied about him. He had to be called the everlasting Father. In what sense? Well, the father of the human race. He had to be a second Adam. So he's also called in this picture of him being Emmanuel, that he would also be called Wonderful and Pelham. He would be doing a work that's an impossible work to do. He's going to stand at the head of humanity and re-go over the ground that Adam had gone through, and then pre-fall and be an overcomer, but also post-fall, that he would overcome sin and he would be the perfect example and perfect righteousness worked out for humanity in himself. He would be made perfect through this suffering that was in this world and through the temptations that came upon him. Now remember, temptation does not necessarily mean that you had to have a fallen nature to be tempted, because Adam and Eve were tempted in the garden, just as Christ was tempted in his divine nature to turn stones into bread. Very fascinating to understand that when the scriptures say that a body has thou prepared for me, or when Luke chapter 1 says that he was called that holy thing, or when it says that the veil was his flesh, or when he was worshipped as God by the Magi. It's very important to understand that God had to be able to look in Christ and to see in him the perfection of humanity as a second Adam, but also as a sympathetic high priest in which all the feelings of our infirmities and our weakness and all of the liabilities that were after 4,000 years after the fall that Christ had to possess both of those features. Christ had to know the weakness of humanity, the frailness of humanity, but not possess the sinfulness of humanity. He was made in the likeness of sinful flesh. He came in humanity, and he possessed all the liabilities and weaknesses, but inside that law that would be the law of selfishness and sin would have disqualified him from being our substitute. So the key feature in part 2 of Michael Marsh's letter to Our Firm Foundation is to clear up the fact that we have to understand that the very nature of Christ, the very body that he possessed, that died for us on Calvary's cross, that was taken into the tomb, and that resurrected on the first day, and then ascended up to heaven and stands today at the right hand of God, that body and that person is the fullness of the Godhead bodily, but fully man and fully representing humanity. A key thing to understand is if sin makes a person more of a man, in other words, if Christ had to possess inbred sin and that made him more of a man, are you stating that in Christ, in sharing in sinfulness, would have made him more of a man? Sin makes us less than a man. Sin eats away at our dignified humanity. And that's the key. Christ did not have to possess sin to be more of a man. It would have made him less than a man. And that's what's so key to understand. This offering that was given is a perfect offering. He possessed our liabilities. He's tempted in all points. He completely understands with an infinite understanding of what it means to be tempted in humanity as no man was tempted. But at the same time, we can have full assurance that Christ stands as our substitute, that he is different than us in the sense that he is imputing to our account an infinite righteousness that is the righteousness of God himself bodily, that we can know that we have an anchor that is sure beyond the veil, that is for humanity, saying, I'm representing humanity and I am eternal. I am the order of Melchizedek. There is no beginning and there is no end. I am their substitute and representative. And if you have faith in him, if you are you're building your assurance upon Christ, that assurance is so solid that you could face the accusations of your enemy who's accusing you day and night and say, but I have an anchor behind that veil. I am sure of my high priest. He is fully man and he is fully God, and his righteousness will stand to defend me on that day.